1884. Europe's most powerful empires gathered in Berlin for one of the most important meetings in history. Only one map dominated the table: Africa, the last great continent, not yet fully divided among Europe's empires. Yet something was missing from that room. Not a single African leader had been invited to decide the future of their own continent. A few signatures, a few strokes of a pen, and the fate of millions would be changed forever. In 1800, Africa was far from empty. It was home to hundreds of kingdoms, millions of people, and civilizations that had flourished for thousands of years. Europeans knew Africa's coasts well. For centuries they had built trading posts and conducted the Atlantic slave trade, but the continent's interior remained a mystery. Many Europeans who ventured inland never returned. Malaria, tropical diseases, and the harsh environment made the continent incredibly difficult to conquer. On European maps, these lands were marked as almost entirely unknown, but soon, a single breakthrough would change everything. The first weapon that helped Europe conquer Africa was not a rifle, it was a medicine. Quinine, extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree, became one of the first effective treatments against malaria. The African interior, once deadly to Europeans, was finally becoming accessible. Routes that had once meant certain death became pathways of exploration. Explorers, soldiers, and cartographers began moving deeper into the continent. The door had finally opened. Africa's unknown interior was no longer waiting to be explored, but to be divided. At that very moment, King Leopold II of Belgium dreamed of something greater. Like the other European empires, he wanted a colony of his own. Leopold first approached the great colonial powers, Spain, Portugal, Britain, but every answer was the same: no. Leopold then turned his attention to lands Europe had not yet claimed: the heart of Africa, the Congo Basin. The expeditions about to begin would change far more than maps. They would reshape the lives of millions forever. Leopold's plan was now in motion. The famous explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, was pushing deep into the heart of Africa along the Congo River. Stanley signed agreements with many local chiefs, but most of these treaties were documents the local people did not fully understand. With every new agreement, the maps became more complete. Leopold's dream of a colony was slowly becoming reality. No one realized it yet. These expeditions were laying the foundation for one of history's most brutal colonial regimes. Leopold's advance into the Congo did not go unnoticed by Europe's great powers. Now, everyone was asking the same question. If Belgium could do it, why couldn't we? One after another, Europe's great powers turned their eyes toward Africa. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and Italy all began moving toward the same continent. Africa was no longer just a continent to explore. Europe's greatest empires had begun a race to divide it. In 1884, Europe's great powers gathered once again in Berlin. This time, their goal was to decide Africa's future. 4 hours. Maps were carefully examined. Africa was no longer seen only as a land to explore, but as a continent to be divided. Many nations were represented at the conference, yet not a single African representative was present. The decisions made in Berlin would completely reshape Africa's political map. The scramble for Africa had officially begun. At the end of the Berlin Conference, a new principle was adopted. Simply claiming land on a map would no longer be enough. Any nation wishing to claim a region had to establish a real presence there. That decision accelerated the race even further. Across the continent, new exploration routes were taking shape. With each passing month, the maps became more detailed. The borders were not fully drawn yet, but Africa's future was now being shaped by decisions made in Europe. After the Berlin Conference, activity spread across every corner of Africa. Each nation wanted to be the first to reach new territories. New routes were being explored. Rivers were carefully mapped. Mountains and valleys were recorded in remarkable detail. But these lands were never empty. For centuries, powerful kingdoms had built their own trade, networks, and rich cultures. But for Europe, this was more than a journey of exploration. Very soon, this race would reshape the destiny of an entire continent. In 1885, a new chapter began for the Congo, but these lands would belong not to a nation, but to one man. After the Berlin Conference, King Leopold II gained international recognition for his control over the Congo. His ambition had become reality. The maps were changing rapidly. New routes were being drawn. New administrations were taking shape. The heart of Africa was entering a completely new era. From the outside, everything appeared orderly, but soon, the Congo would become one of history's darkest colonial stories. At that very moment, the world was demanding a new raw material. Its name was rubber. Bicycles, telegraph cables, electrical systems. The Industrial Revolution demanded more and more rubber. Europe's factories were expanding at an incredible pace, and one of the most valuable resources was hidden inside the forests of the Congo. The Congo was no longer just a vast territory. For Europe, it was becoming one of the world's most valuable natural treasures. Leopold's administrators required every village to collect fixed amounts of rubber. The forest was becoming an obligation rather than a source of life. Rubber was not harvested from plantations, but from wild vines deep inside the rainforest. To reach the rubber vines, people walked for miles every single day. The deep rainforest had become part of their daily lives. After hours of work, every drop of rubber collected was shipped to factories across Europe. Rubber from the Congo forests helped power Europe's industries, but the price of that prosperity was paid by the people of Africa. Month after month, the required amount kept increasing. Many communities struggled under the growing burden. Fields were neglected. Daily life began to change. The rhythm of village life slowly started to disappear. Rubber was bringing immense wealth to Europe, but in the Congo, the cost of that wealth grew heavier every day. At first, the outside world knew very little about what was happening in the Congo, but some travelers and missionaries began recording what they witnessed. Letters, reports, and eyewitness accounts slowly began reaching Europe. The published reports shocked the European public. For the first time, people began asking what was truly happening in the Congo. The silence had been broken. It was no longer just about colonial expansion. The reality of what was happening in the Congo was beginning to emerge. The reports coming from the Congo had become impossible to ignore. A major debate had begun across Europe. Newspapers published fresh reports almost every day. Public opinion was beginning to question Leopold's rule. After years of absolute control, Leopold faced growing international pressure for the first time. The balance of power was beginning to shift. But this was not the end of the colonial race in Africa. The Great Partition was only beginning. The signatures made in Berlin changed not only the fate of the Congo, but the future of all Africa. In the years that followed, Britain, France, Germany, and other European powers would extend their control across almost the entire continent. But did African kingdoms simply surrender? How did Ethiopia remain independent? How did the Zulu, Ashanti, and Mahdist armies resist? We'll explore all of that in the Scramble for Africa, Part 2, step by step.